My name is Lisa Immordino Vreeland, and I'm the director of Peggy Guggenheim Art Addict. Now, I was always fascinated by Peggy Guggenheim. I was an art history major, and I grew up in Italy, and there was something just about her story. And I had read her autobiography at different moments in my life, and thinking of characters to make films. I had done Deanna Vreeland, The Eye Has to Travel, and here once again you have an example of a woman and this very iconic figure who lived the breadth of a century. And so it's not only the aspect of telling the story of her life, but it's also history that becomes a real pivotal role in the movie. And Peggy's life, there's so much to talk about. And in fact, in the end, that was one of the biggest challenge was the fact that we had so much history to tell. And also in the process of making the film, we realized that, her role in art history is it's such a bigger impact than we had ever imagined. And it's a story about a very courageous woman, and that was something that really attracted me to her from the very beginning. So one of the great joys of making this film was also the amount of material we had, because we not only had the paintings. So the paintings themselves that Peggy had collected became a character in the film and a storytelling character in the film. But then we had all this wonderful archival footage, not only of Peggy herself, but of the artists. And this was, first of all, a moment to be able to, when Peggy was talking about the artists, to be able to illustrate it with the actual artist. And you don't have many films that can do that. And often I think it can almost be too straightforward in telling the story this way. She talks about the artist and you show them. But it was just a natural in this case, because we really had found some very rare footage. And of course, the most rare footage that we have is these audio tapes. And Jackie Bogard-Well was considered the only authorized biographer for Peggy Guggenheim, because she actually sat with her and collaborated with her on the book. And Peggy at the time was opened up basically her home to Jackie and shared a lot of information with her, shared papers with her, and then they would have these conversations, and these conversations lasted over 2 summers. And you can see the difference between the tapes, because the conversation toward the end of her life was, she was kind of not as, she just was not as willing to share her story in a way. She was just, she literally died almost 6 months after this last interview. And the tapes, initially we did not know that the tapes existed when we first started making the film. And in the process of it, we optioned the Wayward Guggenheim, and then we found out that the tapes were also part of, that they existed. And so we basically, once we started to use the tapes, we just stripped all the material out that we had and started to replace it. And it was a very slow process, but once we committed to them, that's what we used. And Jackie's question played a very pivotal role in helping us tell our story, because sometimes we just did not have sound bites unless we used a talking head to do that, if it was one of our interview subjects. But in the case of with Jackie's questions, we really could use those. We could use those sound bites to be able to push the narrative along. No, we definitely, first we were going to have an actress do the narration of the film, and we played with that, and we were going to use parts of Jackie's book and from different interviews and different resources. And I think when we decided that we were going to start to use the tapes, we really, committed to it. But it was not an immediate thing, because the tapes themselves, Peggy does not give us that much on the tapes at times. And that was we were hoping to really come up with some really good things. But what was great about it is that she tends to say the same stories. And so what she had written very much in her own autobiography, she replicated in many of the tapes, in almost verbatim in her answers with Jackie. And so, it was not an immediate thing, because her answers were often also very short. And so we really had to work on it and develop it. And once we did, then, it was very much of a commitment. Going into the movie, I felt like I knew a lot about Peggy, but then I was pleasantly surprised and also disappointed, because there were times that I was not sure I really was in love with my character. And I think it's really important to really love the character. And you know, the overwhelming sense of sadness and tragedy that was in her life, it did not hit me as much until we were in the film, because I had based a lot of my research also on a lot of just her own writing and her autobiography. And she had a very nonchalant way of reporting incidents that happened in her life, from, you know, having sex with Samuel Beckett to, oh, I had 7 abortions. And, you know, there was this kind of very léger way of communicating things. And so it's, you know, it's clear that her personality has overshadowed what her accomplishments in the art world were. And, you know, once we started to see this footage of her, you know, you could see that there was a real sense of insecurity, of, you know, just not really being comfortable in her own skin. And that definitely, you know, made us think twice on how we wanted to tell the story. And it was really important to show this personal side of her, because, you know, historically, she has not been taken seriously, and it has a lot to do with her personality and the fact that, you know, half of her legacy lies in the amount of men she slept with, which frankly has nothing to do with her story. But it's exciting because they were great men she slept with, and people have chosen to talk about that because she chose to speak about it, and it really did underplay what her accomplishments were, and her accomplishments are huge and much more important than people realize, and that's what was really intrigued us, and that we hope we accomplished in communicating the film. You know, I think that she definitely has been underappreciated, and most importantly by the art world. And I think that this film, it's interesting to see people, and there have obviously been a lot of, from museum directors to art historians, who have seen the film and they are really intrigued by it and ask questions about it, and they just said, you know, well, we didn't realize that Peggy had done this or done that, and you know, she had, if they're not, and so far, no one has been able to give me an example of another person, whether it's a man or a woman, who was so implicated across, and whose legacy plays such a role in so many different countries. And you know, she had a hand in modern art in England, France, the United States, and in Italy. And there are not that many historical figures. And in fact, I can't think of any. And so I do think that this film it's not only going to show her personal side and perhaps her personal shortcomings, but it certainly displays what her achievements are. And she deserves this, and she deserves much more. You know, it's interesting because I work with really strong teams and people who have been trained in filmmaking, and you know, they have so much more knowledge than I do. And I started filmmaking very late in my life, and it was really out of a need to tell a story. And I think ultimately that's what it's about. And I plan, you know, when I plan to make a film, I think about initially all the research involved, and I'm a very detailed researcher, and that I think plays, especially when you're doing a documentary film, it's about really trying to uncover every stone out there, and it's about connections with you talking to one person, and then somebody says, oh, you should go and talk to that other person, but it's about being really just curious about everything and looking at every detail. And in these historical films, you know, what's so nice is that you're not only telling the story about the character, the main character, but then you also have the century to be able to, you know, play with. And I clearly am very attracted to the 20th century. And I kind of keep staying there because there's so many strong people whose stories haven't been told in a funny way. And you know, for me, it's, you know, people can tell stories in different ways, and you have a writer that would take on Peggy Guggenheim in a certain way. Visually, for us, in telling her story, we had so many elements, and this is what's was so wonderful about a film like this, because it was rich with imagery, and you know, you often also have these elements, like a painting on a screen can be very boring. It's just a painting, and we really tried to make character in the film. And when we were talking about World War II, we all of a sudden had all of the paintings that she collected, and those were all accurate art historically in there, and that's part of a filmmaker's process of making sure that the research is correct, double checking. And you know, I'm not young, but as a filmmaker, I'm young. And every time going through the process, I learned something new of, I could have done this, I could have done that. And I think that that's all part of it. But it's really about loving what you're doing. And I think it's about having this passion to want to tell the story, and also being curious, because, you know, there are not many opportunities in life that you can devote this amount of time and devote it exclusively to a métier and or to a person or to a moment in history, and learn as much as you can about it. So I feel very fortunate. I feel that this is the best kind of job for me, because I'm put in a position that I'm learning something, but then hopefully you are all learning something. And it's interesting because in the Peggy Guggenheim film right now, I've been getting lots of, you know, messages from people saying, we couldn't stop talking about the film. But it's not because the film was done in a certain way, but it incites a conversation. And that's ultimately what a film should do, is that you don't just walk out of it and say, oh, you know, that was great. But it's, you know, made people more curious and made people think in a different way. And that's what I hope we can all achieve in making movies.